The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. Each week, we discuss trending topics and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to have with us Chris Wubbolt. He's principal of QACV Consulting, and I invited him here to talk about risk mitigation in software as a service solution. So welcome, Chris. Great to have you here with us again.
Thanks, Stacey. It's always a pleasure to provide my to be involved in these podcasts. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Fantastic. I wanted to talk about software as a service solutions in that they're cloud-based applications that are used in many industries in a variety of ways. And inherent security risks are present in most internet-reliant systems, but industries for whom GxP compliance is necessary require higher standards and added data integrity checkpoints. And I'm hoping that you can talk about the specific nuances of software as a service in the GxP environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really great topic. It's been a topic that's been out there for a long time, and it's always changing, and the technologies are getting better, and also the hackers that are trying to invade those proprietary databases or systems are also getting better as well. So it's really important. It's an ongoing topic that I think is important for the entire world, especially in the advent of pandemics and things like that, where more and more organizations are relying on those remote capabilities and tools to provide remote capabilities. Security is important for all industries, as you mentioned, but especially the differences, I think, in the GxP industry, for pharmaceutical or medical device companies that use software as a service, is that we have to be able to demonstrate through qualification and evaluation of these different vendors and the different applications that are being used. We have to be able to demonstrate that there are adequate controls and procedures and processes and checkpoints that are in place. So again, the requirement for security is just as stringent for other companies, but we have to be able to demonstrate it as part of our qualification process and our assessment process of some of these vendors. And not only the vendors that provide software, but the actual cloud computing environments that they may use. There are a lot of private data centers that are used by some of these organizations, but there are also a lot of what I would call more public type of cloud environments with AWS or Azure and so forth, Microsoft Azure, and those are for me. And I'm a traditional compliance person, so I'm always skeptical of new technologies until they're proven. And I consider the compliance aspects and approaches of these technologies and what the potential risks might be. So, but I truly feel that AWS and Azure and those types of public environments probably have better security requirements and programs in place and redundancies in place than a pharmaceutical company who is in the business to make pharmaceutical products or research pharmaceutical products, for example. However, we still have to make sure that they have the proper controls in place in those organizations, and that's a little bit more difficult to do with some of those cloud computing environments where they don't allow audits and things like that. But I do feel that those organizations they do, that's what they do. They do have stronger security controls and requirements. you do see the news broadcasts and so forth, and the news reports of companies in AWS that may have been hacked and so forth.
Right.
That's not necessarily because of AWS or Azure or their controls. It's many times it's because the company that has set up that virtual environment within the AWS cloud environment, for example, and that they haven't set up their security profiles within their virtual environment correctly. And so they've opened up vulnerabilities that allow their environments to be hacked, and they haven't really utilized or implemented the AWS controls or the Microsoft Azure controls as appropriately as they should have. So that's really one of the risks that we think in our industry, that because we're using a cloud provider of some type, that we have all the security controls that are in place and that we are good to go. But we still have a job to do. We have to make sure that those security profiles are set up appropriately and that they're configured and that we know that they're maintained, so that we do have that higher level of security in our GXP environment that ensures that we maintain confidential information, proprietary information, private information, and that it's not being hacked by outside sources and so forth.
And Chris, just in a follow-up to that, do you feel like the reason for pharma companies not having correct setup or not having the security protocols in place fully, is that because they're wrongly assuming that it's already been done, or are they just failing to follow through?
I'm not saying it's necessarily pharmaceutical companies, but any company that may use a cloud environment,
right.
They have to do their due diligence. They can't just rely on what is, saying we're going to use this AWS environment and we're good. We're set. They have to really understand what are the different service options that those organizations can provide, because it's all what you pay for, right? So you can have the lowest level tier of services and have very little security capability, or you can understand that you may have to pay for more to have a greater level of security based upon the risk of the information that you're trying to maintain and so forth. So, one thing. People have to have an understanding and knowledge of what the capabilities are, what's turned on, what's turned off, and so forth. I was just speaking with a colleague of mine this morning, John Patterson, who was telling me of an assessment he's getting involved in, where there was a environmental monitoring software solution that was it was never turned on. The backup capabilities were never turned on in the computing environment, so they were collecting all this data for temperature and humidity and so forth, and it was being backed up or it was being maintained, but it was never being backed up because that was never turned on. So that can happen in a cloud environment also with security risks. And if you don't turn on the features that are available, if you're not aware that those features are available, then you're not going to have the appropriate controls in place. So that's something that I think people you can't just rely on a vendor. You have to be, regardless of who that vendor is, a contract manufacturing organization or a clinical research organization or a cloud computing environment, you have to still be involved and understand what the capabilities are and ensure and verify that those features that are most important to you, in this case security and confidentiality and so forth, that they're actually working as you intend to do. So that's part of the qualification and the assessment process that we're expected to follow and meeting in a regulated environment that we're in.
And so speaking of that, Chris, because obviously cloud-based solutions have been around a long time. This is not a new topic, as you mentioned at the beginning, but we are seeing more and more regulated industry players, such as medical device and pharma manufacturers, starting to use software as a service more and more. And, there's obviously different options for them. They can purchase off the shelf, so to speak, software that's sort of ready-made, or they can have applications that are configured specifically for them in their environment. But either way, talking about regulated activities, does using a software vendor like this, like we're speaking of, mean that you're exempt from performing validation activities? And can companies use vendor supplied documentation in their validation? If so.
Well, if you are listening to software vendors only, not all software vendors, but many, they'll say that they have validated software for you to use. Mm-hmm. However, as anyone that's involved in the pharmaceutical industry or medical device industry knows, validation is performed by the end user. So if you're using commercial off-the-shelf software, that's fine. There's an expectation that you've done an assessment of that software vendor's quality systems and practices and how they develop software and how much they might support validation for your company. But the ultimate responsibility for validation is from the end user. And so that doesn't mean that you can't leverage what that vendor has done. But if you have never assessed that vendor for their practices or reviewed their documentation, then you really can't leverage that documentation or their validation package. And even if you have assessed them, these validation packages are really as good as they're only useful to an extent, because all these applications are very highly configurable. So they are commercial off-the-shelf software, but they're configured applications that can do a lot or a little. And sometimes you have interfaces with other applications and other software that's being used at your organization. And so if you receive a validation package from a vendor, and that package is based on a default software configuration for they've developed for their standard release, and then you modify that configuration because you're using it for your intended use, for how you expect to use the system, then that validation package is no longer reflective of your system, and it's not really useful unless you modify that validation package or enhance it to incorporate your intended use, your workflows, your business processes within the validation of the application. So you can.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. Yeah, and obviously, with software in the cloud, you're theoretically always changing, right? Because updates come to you much quicker and that kind of thing. Therefore, making it necessary to make regular and consistent updates in-house, or if it's constantly being updated, I would think that it makes sense that periodic testing or revalidation tasks are necessary then. Is that the case? And can you talk about expectations for continuous validation?
Oh, definitely. So all software that's validated needs to go through a change control process in order. Whenever there's a change that's being made, that change has to be assessed to determine the impact of that change on the software, and also what other validation activities you may need to complete or conduct in order to maintain that software in a validated state. But for software as a service, especially in multi-tenant environments where the vendor can have releases 2 or 3 times a year. So I know some vendors have tried to have major releases on a monthly basis, which personally I think is
it's a lot
to sustain. Yes. So the software company back in the old days before software as a service, whenever any change was made to software, a minor change in a patch, a configuration change, they had to go through change control. So that's something that requirement has not changed in the regulated industry. You still need to have change control and to do assessment of each change. And again, major changes are released to customers 2 or 3 or more times a year. But these vendors also have releases that are maybe more minor, or emergency patches, or minor changes that might be released as well, that are not always. Sometimes customers are not notified of those emergency patches that are used to fix, critical data integrity issues or other things bugs that might pop up in the software. So the need for there's a concept in computerized system validation called periodic review. Annex 11 requires it, actually, which is the European regulation for computer
regulatory, right?
And so sometimes companies have, based on their own procedures and risk assessments and so forth, they have periodic review on sometimes every 2 years, every 3 years. Some companies do it annually, I think when you're using a software as a service vendor and they can make major releases 2 or 3 times a year, or maybe minor or emergency patches even more frequently, I think companies have to really understand the risk of that and possibly increase their periodic review frequency so that they're actually doing this assessment and possibly in some cases doing additional revalidation tasks, maybe additional testing or regression testing that they may not have done as frequently in the past, but they probably need to consider that because of they have no control really in many cases on how often the releases are coming from their vendors, including
absolutely. I would agree. And it sounds like they are going to be the ones liable for it in the end, the change, going through the change control process. And it certainly needs to be part of their protocol, I would think.
Well, one thing, if there's a issue with during a regulatory inspection and there's a 483 that's issued, the software vendor will not get that 483. It's going to be the pharmaceutical company or the medical device company that gets the 483 for inadequate validation. So the software vendor may partially be responsible, but it's really the controls that are implemented, as we discussed earlier, the controls that are implemented by the pharmaceutical company, by their customer, to ensure that the systems remain qualified or validated for intended use.
That's interesting. So I'm going to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, in the sense that I know this can be a little murky water sort of for the vendor, the software or software as a service vendor versus the end user. Can you talk a little bit more in detail about what the responsibilities are on either side? Because I think sometimes the end users can wrongly assume that the vendor is responsible for much more than they actually are.
Yeah, that's a good point. And this is going to be a QA answer for you, but it really depends. And yeah. I'll give the criteria for why that is my answer. So again, traditionally, the software developer was a software development company. They developed software, and then they sold that software for installation and validation at their clients' sites. Now with software as a service, those vendors are actually they're not just developing software, but they're supporting the software in terms of they're helping with validation, as we discussed. They're actually doing backup and restore testing and disaster recovery programs. So they're implementing security, and depending upon the robustness or maturity of the vendor and their application, the vendor may or may not be involved in configuration, or even simple things like user account management for software applications. So it really depends on what that vendor is capable of doing and the agreement that the vendor has with their customers. And that's so important, those responsibilities, because as you said, things could fall through the cracks. And so you really need to define who has the responsibilities, and I would recommend that be documented in an approved quality agreement, which indicates what the vendor is responsible for and what the pharmaceutical or medical device company is responsible for. Annex 11 calls that a formal agreement. Other terms might be service agreements. It's not the same as a service level agreement, although it may incorporate some elements of that into the quality agreement. But I like to use the term quality agreement, where it defines responsibilities and activities that are necessary to maintain the system in a validated state, including the records and data that are maintained by those systems as well, the backup and restore processes, business continuity, disaster recovery, and so forth.
Right. It sounds like it would definitely be in the company's best interest to have all of that in writing and understand who's going to perform each task. So thank you. So, obviously the industry, any industry, where continual changes and innovations to products, regulations, and markets are the norm, which they are here. Can you talk about how cloud-based systems can actually provide greater agility for these organizations, especially in regulated environments?
Well, I think some of the advantages of software as service vendors and cloud environments is that the life science companies can really focus on what they do best, and that is again doing clinical research, non-clinical research, manufacturing products, and so forth. And then they can rely on the cloud environments and those organizations, those software as service providers and so forth to maintain software, to develop software, maintain those environments, have levels of security and redundancy in those cloud environments. And I think that allows companies to focus on those environments. I work with a lot of very large and very well-established companies in the industry, but also there are many virtual companies that are have started up that are really playing an important role in clinical research and identifying new innovative therapies and so forth. And without that type of cloud environment, I don't think that we'd have as many virtual companies that are out there that are actually doing this type of work and providing really important research for potential new life-saving medicines and therapies and medical devices and so forth. So it just wouldn't be as possible or as feasible to do it without having these virtual cloud environments to support this. But again, having said that, you need to have the appropriate control. We're still in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry, regulated by the FDA and MHRA and EMA and so forth, and we need to have the appropriate controls in place to ensure that the data that we collect and that maintain and the controls and processes have integrity and they meet the requirements in our industry. So there's great benefit to it, with the appropriate controls in place to ensure that that benefit is not misused or adulterated in some way.
Right. And I'd be just even outside of the regulated industries right now in the state that we're in, where everybody is now working remotely due to the pandemic. I don't think we would have been able to make that transition as quickly or as smoothly if we didn't have all of this information in the cloud and all of these different service providers ready to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is a great example of having some of those the benefit for having some of those virtual environments. Again, I'm a traditional QA compliance person, so having the appropriate controls in place also.
Right, and I would agree. We've seen people take advantage of different situations because of security, improper security. So I definitely have to have the controls in place. But I think that we're just proving that there is value in having cloud-based solutions and the right tools, especially if you're going to be working in a virtual environment.
That's correct.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about whether this is more cost-effective option for organizations? And we talked a lot about the security, but what about the cost-effectiveness of it? And I mean, I'm guessing there's downsides to any solution. So if you can talk a little bit about where the greatest risk factors still lie in software as a service, and is the price point one of them?
Yeah, I think that cost effectiveness, that was a driving factor in the advent of cloud computing initially. I'm not so sure that that's as true any longer. It still may be to some degree, but not as much. For example, now one software as a service vendor that I've audited many times in the past, and I've seen their progression and how they've changed over the last 5 or 7 years and so forth. And they initially had a private data center that they used for their environment, and it was a California company. Mm-hmm. And they I think at that point they had maybe 2 or 3 security people that were part of their security group
Sure.
that were responsible for security, implementing programs and so forth. And a couple of years ago, they went to a public cloud environment and they went through their processes to qualify that environment and so forth. But now they actually have, instead of 2 or 3 security representatives in that security group, they have, I think, 24 or so. So that's expensive. So when you go from 2 people to 24 people or 25 people, that's a pretty big factor of additional resources that are needed for security.
Sure.
And so I think there is some cost benefit probably, but I'm not sure what the if it's really a driving factor at this point any longer. I think there's other driving factors, and I would not say that a cloud environment is less expensive than a traditional environment. And pharmaceutical companies still and life science companies still have to do their own work. They can't just wash their hands of it and say it's the software vendor's responsibility. It's the life science company's responsibility also.
Right. Yes. I think we've definitely established that today. In closing, or before we close up, Chris, today, can you give our listeners a few tips for vetting a software as a service provider or vendor? What are some key things that they should look for, or some important questions to ask?
Yeah, I definitely, I'm a proponent of doing assessments or audits of software vendors, and really not just for a compliance perspective, but really so that the organization can understand how the vendor releases their software. What's the frequency? What's their notification time period for how frequently they notify their clients of, or how much time do they give their clients to properly vet a new release and so forth. What are their programs? Do they have adequate disaster recovery testing that's done and so forth? One audit that I did of a vendor that I was involved in previously, that I audited previously, they actually had a disaster recovery test that failed, but they said it passed, although it didn't complete as expected. And so no matter how good the software is, if you lose that data that's associated with that software, you lose everything. So I think it's really important to do these assessments, these audits, and again, from a compliance perspective, but also from to identify what are the actual practices that these vendors are providing or offering. Are they adequate? What do we need to know as their customers? What do we need to know so that we can, on our end, maybe mitigate some of the risk identified with vendors' practices, and ensure that if there are issues that occur, that we know how long a application can come back up and running, and so forth. So I would definitely do an assessment, and it's a compliance expectation actually, and I would make sure that I have governance and monitoring over that vendor with periodic governance meetings to go through any issues that are occurring, any new features that might be upcoming, and things like that. So I think just not washing your hands from what of the software vendors and saying it's yours. You have to really understand it, have governance, and then monitor those vendors and make sure that any issues that come up are identified and addressed in an appropriate manner.
Of course. That's a lot to think about. So obviously, if someone's not just jumping into this, then you need to spend time and do your due diligence with your research and your questioning, and really make sure it's a good fit for your organization, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think so. And again, you have to understand, just because you're relying on a vendor, it doesn't matter if it's a software vendor or a CMO or a CRO, the life science company is still responsible. They're the ones that are going to be cited for a regulatory observation, or they're the ones that are going to have a product that's not going to be approved, possibly because of data integrity issues or other issues that might occur because of the use of any vendor, a software vendor, a contract manufacturer, a laboratory, and so forth. So ultimately, the life science company is still responsible and accountable for the compliance and controls established around these types of vendors.
Right, absolutely, and that came across clear today. So hopefully, listeners understand that even if they are using vendors for any of their cloud-based solutions, they are ultimately the buck stops with them. First, they are the one that's ultimately responsible, and hopefully they're taking precautions and understanding what their role is at all times.
The vendor will never get the 43. It'll be the pharmaceutical company or the life science company.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Before we close, anything else that you think our listeners should know on this topic today?
Well, do due diligence. The purpose of these assessments is really for better understanding of practices, and there's so much you can learn during an audit or an assessment. And do your due diligence, have governance, and throughout this coronavirus pandemic, make sure you wash your hands.
Yes, wash them once and twice, or do it correctly the first time. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure having you here with us again. I do appreciate the time you spent and all of the great information that you've provided so that our listeners can make sure that they are protecting themselves whenever they're using software as a service. I want to say thank you also to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And I also want to give a big shout out to you, all our valued listeners. If you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And I ask you to please share with your colleagues and online networks. The more referrals you give, the more listeners we get, and we do appreciate that, so we can keep bringing more great content to you. For information on today's podcast and links from the show, please see our show notes at www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, stay safe and healthy.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.